The book is really a history of how competition changed in the United States between, let's say, the immediate post-World War II period and the period through which you are living now. If you have a sense that competition now is much more intense than it used to be, you're absolutely right. It is very, very intense. And it's intense because the American political system worked in the 1970s and 80s to make it more intense. When we came out of the Second World War, we were the only economy left standing. And as a result, because there was no competition, we became very complacent. I was talking to Jerry about the automobile industry. You all look probably too young to remember that there used to be basically 3 car companies in the United States. There were 3 companies: General Motors, Ford, to a lesser extent Chrysler, and then there were companies like Studebaker, American Motors. There were basically 3 car companies in the United States. And they were very complacent. Nobody in the United States could imagine that the Germans or the Japanese would ever really challenge these 3 American car companies. In fact, people overseas didn't really understand it. The Japanese wanted to have a car industry that looked like the American industry. We were unrivaled, and we got very fat and happy. The same was true of the steel industry, which I talk about in the book. The same was true in a whole lot of other industries where you didn't have foreign competition. It was true in finance. They were powerful and very big financial institutions centered in New York, the banks especially, but the New York Stock Exchange was really totally dominant at the time. So if you needed money, you pretty much had to go to New York and to the New York banks or to the New York Stock Exchange. The same was true in retailing. Almost every town had a department store. That department store was a very powerful part of the local establishment. Competition was limited. You can look at almost any of the sectors of the American economy. You look at, we were talking, the word regulation was used. AT&T was the phone company. You didn't have a bunch of choices the way we have now to get, there was AT&T, not the AT&T now, which is just the name AT&T, but AT&T probably had 80% of the telephone business. The trucking industry was essentially cartelized. Truckers could get together and they had what were called rate bureaus, and they could get together and set prices in trucking. So you would have paid here to ship things anywhere out of the state. You would have paid a fixed fee that the truckers had arranged. The same was true in airlines, for example. There had been no new airlines in the United States since 1938. A lot of this came out of the New Deal. New Deal, they were very concerned with falling prices. So they tried to allow people to set prices so that they wouldn't have this phenomena that you had from 1932 on of falling prices everywhere. So this began to change. What you had was these opposite and rival interests. In 1980, let's start out with cars. The car industry, again, they had no idea that they were ever going to face competition. I went to Washington the first time I ever had been in Washington in the late 50s to hear the leader of the automobile union urge the American companies to build small cars. The 3 leaders of the American car industry were there, and they said, "Who are you, a union leader, to tell us that we ought to make small cars? Volkswagen can make cars and sell them here. We don't care. They get 5% of the market. We'll give them 5% of the market. But we can't make small cars in the United States. Small cars, you can't make money on small cars in the United States. Many years later, in 1980, we had the oil crisis. Everybody wanted small cars. None of the American companies were making them. That was when the Japanese started to sell significant numbers of cars. And so the big companies, the American companies, tried to get protection of the car industry, tried to get the government to put high tariffs on on Japanese cars coming in. The government refused to do it. It was a very contentious political issue. The government said, look, it's not because the Japanese are selling cars unfairly, it's because you don't produce any small cars. So after this, there was a political battle over this, but basically we allowed the Japanese to come in. Well, count the number of car companies we now have in the United States. I mean, I don't know how many of you, the Korean cars are starting to come in. We have Toyota, we have Nissan, we have Subaru, Mazda. All these new companies were allowed to come in. So you have terrific competition in the automobile industry. And the cars are so much better. Volkswagen used to advertise that you could get 200,000 miles on a Volkswagen. They had advertisements way back. And no American car would get 200,000 miles at the time. It just didn't happen. 60,000 miles was a very old car. So this happened in steel as well. In the steel industry, these guys went over to Europe after the war, and they showed the Europeans how, they thought, we'll show these Europeans how to make steel. And so they went over and they were very confident that we knew everything. By the 1970s, we were starting to develop new mills in the United States. They're called mini mills, but they had 50% of the market, and they also were capable of competing with the imported steel. They were very efficient. There was a man named Ken Iverson. Anyway, Ken Iverson, it was then Nucor, which I think a lot of you, Ken Iverson said, I can compete with the Europeans and with the Japanese, and I can make a better product than he did in the United States. In the car business, you had similar people. So this industry was transformed, and here we have a lot of people would ask me before, well, this is all imports that have done this. But it wasn't imports that changed AT&T, that brought in all of the competition that you now have in the telecommunications area. It was not foreign imports that changed American finance. There were big battles about this, big political battles in Washington. The truckers and the trucking unions wanted to be regulated. Why did they want to be regulated? Because you could get monopoly profits and monopoly wages. The American idea, or Americans tend to think that the unions and the companies are against each other. In each one of these cases where we took off price controls, the unions and the companies wanted to keep the price controls because the price controls allowed, again, not only monopoly prices, but monopoly wages. So people in the car industry got much higher wages than people in smaller firms. The people in the steel industry got much higher wages than the people in the competitive part of the market. The railroad workers got much more money, could get much more money than the people where there was competition. So this is probably what you guys face. I mean, you have, where there's competition, there's a lot of downward pressure on wages. And again, you're facing, in sales, you're facing domestic competition. You may have a Japanese machine, but your competitors are other people selling maybe other Japanese machines. And I think from what I have been reading about the copier business, I mean, at one point Xerox was like General Motors. It was the dominant player. All these new Japanese competitors come in, but for the sales staff, that changes the way you all live, because you have domestic competition for sales. It's not the foreign so much that there's a cheap Japanese machine coming in. It's that all the Japanese machines are competing here, or Japanese machines made in China or someplace like that. So this competition, one of the points I always make is it's not principally import competition. It's the competition now in trucking and in finance, where you had these, in finance, I think most of you are familiar with NASDAQ. When the NASDAQ market was made, they were concerned, the politicians in Washington were concerned that the markets for small companies were being fixed, that the margins were too big, that the brokers were taking too much money. So they tried to they helped organize this NASDAQ market, which became a real competitor with the New York Stock Exchange. And that real competitor meant that the companies that were trying to get financing on the stock markets had choices that had never existed before. So the whole economy, not just the import-related economy, but the whole economy is much more competitive than it was in the late 1970s.